There comes a moment when we stand before the mirror of our souls, believing that our good intentions automatically open the gates of heaven. But through the eyes of eternity, many of our daily choices, no matter how well-meaning they appear, can become shadows that obstruct the brilliant light of divine grace. Our Lady of Fatima, the Queen of Heaven who appeared to 3 shepherd children in Portugal, left behind more than just prophecies and secrets. She revealed a silent warning that transformed forever how we should approach our spiritual lives in the modern world. It wasn't a thunderous revelation or a miracle visible to crowds of thousands. It was a gentle whisper of grace, something that few discuss, but every believer should understand deeply. There exist 5 modern behaviors that we must never allow into our hearts, 5 spiritual pitfalls that, although they seem like virtues, can unknowingly postpone the mercy we desperately seek. What's most surprising is that the majority of us have already fallen into at least 3 of them. In this message, we'll explore each of these spiritual dangers one by one, and when we reach the final one, the most treacherous of all, you might be shocked to recognize it. It's a behavior so common that it has infiltrated even our churches, our prayer groups, and our most sincere attempts at holiness. But before we begin this spiritual journey, pause for a moment and offer this simple prayer in silence. Jesus, I trust in you. A brief but powerful plea for someone who perhaps still waits in the shadows of spiritual mediocrity. It was during a cold February evening in Denver, Colorado, when Maria Rodriguez experienced something that would change her understanding of faith forever. She had been attending daily mass at St. Patrick's Cathedral for 3 months, desperately seeking answers after losing her job as a financial advisor. The church was nearly empty, just a few elderly parishioners scattered across the wooden pews, when something extraordinary happened during the consecration. As Father Michael Sullivan raised the host, Maria felt an overwhelming presence beside her. She turned slightly and saw what appeared to be a woman in brilliant white, though no one else seemed to notice. The figure didn't speak with words, but Maria understood immediately. This presence was showing her something profound about the way modern Catholics approach their relationship with God. In her journal that night, Maria wrote, "She appeared to me not with accusations, but with gentle correction. I realized that everything I thought was bringing me closer to God might actually be creating distance." That encounter marked a turning point not just in Maria's spiritual life, but in her understanding of how Our Lady of Fatima continues to guide souls in contemporary America. She realized that the Queen of Heaven doesn't need dramatic apparitions to communicate with us today. Instead, she works through subtle interior movements, quiet inspirations, and gentle corrections that redirect our hearts toward authentic holiness. From that moment forward, every spiritual practice Maria engaged in was surrounded by holy caution and profound love. She began to understand something that many modern Christians ignore. God doesn't need our impressive religious performances. He desires our authentic surrender. Now let's examine the first spiritual danger that Our Lady of Fatima wants us to avoid in our contemporary faith journey. God, I can't handle this financial stress anymore. My entire world is falling apart. I don't know how I'll survive without this promotion. These words flow from hearts overwhelmed by life's pressures, cries of genuine anguish and human vulnerability. However, Our Lady of Fatima gently alerts us that when our prayers become entirely consumed with our problems, we might unintentionally create something we never intended, a spiritual life that revolves around ourselves rather than God. This isn't about denying our struggles or pretending that hardships don't matter. It's about understanding that prayer consumed entirely by our difficulties can transform our relationship with God into a cosmic customer service experience. When we approach the throne of grace only with complaints, demands, and desperate bargaining, we miss the profound transformation that authentic prayer offers. Consider the difference between these 2 approaches to prayer. God, fix my marriage because I can't be happy without it, versus God, help me become the spouse you're calling me to be, regardless of the outcome. The first prayer makes our happiness the goal and God the means. The second prayer makes God's will the goal and our happiness a beautiful consequence. Our Lady of Fatima understood this distinction perfectly. When she appeared to Lucia, Francisco, and Jacinta in Portugal, she didn't promise them easy lives or quick solutions to their problems. Instead, she called them to deeper prayer, sacrifice, and trust in God's mysterious providence. She showed them that authentic spirituality isn't about getting God to change our circumstances. It's about allowing God to change our hearts within whatever circumstances we face. Think about how often our prayer requests focus entirely on external changes: better health, financial security, relationship harmony, career advancement. While these concerns are valid, and God certainly cares about every aspect of our lives, when they become the exclusive content of our spiritual dialogue, we risk reducing the Almighty to a divine problem solver, rather than encountering Him as the source of all meaning and joy. The spiritual danger here is subtle but profound. When our prayers are dominated by problem-solving requests, we unconsciously communicate to ourselves and to God that our peace depends on external circumstances rather than on His presence. This mindset can actually delay the very peace we're seeking because it keeps us trapped in a cycle of spiritual anxiety, rather than opening us to the transformative power of surrender. Maria Rodriguez discovered this truth during her months of unemployment. Initially, every prayer was a desperate plea for job opportunities, financial miracles, and quick relief from her anxiety. But after her encounter with the mysterious presence in St. Patrick's Cathedral, she began to pray differently. Instead of demanding solutions, she began offering her uncertainty to God as a gift. Instead of bargaining for specific outcomes, she started asking for the grace to trust His timing and wisdom. The remarkable thing that happened next wasn't a miraculous job offer or unexpected financial windfall. What changed was Maria herself. She began to experience a deep peace that didn't depend on her employment status. She discovered talents and interests she had never explored before. She developed relationships with people she might never have met if she had remained comfortable in her previous position. When employment opportunities finally did arise, she approached them from a place of strength and clarity rather than desperation and fear. This transformation illustrates what Our Lady of Fatima wants every modern believer to understand. God's primary concern isn't changing our external circumstances to match our preferences. His deepest desire is to change our hearts to reflect His love, regardless of what's happening around us. When we make our problems the center of our spiritual life, we inadvertently resist this divine transformation that could bring us far greater joy than any external change ever could. This story illustrates what Our Lady of Fatima wants every modern believer to understand. Authentic prayer isn't about convincing God to change His mind about our circumstances. It's about opening our hearts to be changed by His love, wisdom, and grace. When we release our attachment to specific outcomes and trust in God's perfect knowledge of what we truly need, we create space for miracles that far exceed anything we could have imagined or requested. Why does it seem like God answers everyone else's prayers but mine? This question echoed through the heart of Michael O'Brien, a high school history teacher from Minneapolis, Minnesota, as he sat in the back pew of Our Lady of Lourdes Church following Sunday evening Mass. Around him, he observed what appeared to be a thriving faith community: families with well-behaved children, couples holding hands in prayer, elderly parishioners with serene expressions of peace. Meanwhile, Michael struggled with persistent anxiety, financial worries from his wife's medical bills, and a teenage son who had recently announced he no longer believed in God. Michael's spiritual struggle reveals the fourth danger that Our Lady of Fatima wants us to recognize: the temptation to measure our spiritual progress and God's love for us by comparing our internal struggles with other people's external appearances. This spiritual comparison trap has become particularly acute in our social media age, where we're constantly exposed to carefully curated glimpses of other people's faith journeys, their answered prayers, their spiritual victories, and their religious milestones. The insidious nature of this spiritual danger lies in how reasonable it can seem. After all, if God truly loves all His children equally, why do some people seem to experience more obvious blessings, clearer guidance, or easier spiritual lives? Why do some prayers appear to be answered immediately, while others seem to echo unanswered for years? These questions can lead us down a path of spiritual discouragement that ultimately separates us from the very source of peace we're seeking. Our Lady of Fatima encountered this dynamic even among the 3 shepherd children she chose as her messengers. Lucia, Francisco, and Jacinta each experienced her apparitions differently. Lucia could see, hear, and speak with Our Lady. Francisco could see her but couldn't hear her voice. Jacinta could see and hear but couldn't speak directly with the apparition. If these children had fallen into spiritual comparison, they might have questioned why their experiences weren't identical, why one received certain graces that others didn't, or whether God loved them less because their encounters differed. Instead, Our Lady taught them that God's love expresses itself uniquely in each soul's life, according to His perfect wisdom and our individual needs. Francisco's inability to hear Our Lady's voice didn't indicate that he was less favored. It reflected God's particular plan for his spiritual development. His role was to offer comfort to Jesus in the Eucharist, a calling that required deep interior silence and contemplation, rather than external communication. Jacinta's gift of hearing but not speaking with Our Lady prepared her to become a powerful intercessor whose prayers would benefit countless souls she would never meet on earth. Michael O'Brien's struggle with spiritual comparison intensified during a parish retreat where testimonies were shared about miraculous healings, financial breakthroughs, and dramatic conversions. While he genuinely rejoiced for others' blessings, he couldn't help wondering why his own prayers for his wife's health and his son's return to faith seemed unanswered. The retreat speaker, Sister Margaret Kelly, a Dominican nun who had worked in hospital chaplaincy for 25 years, recognized the spiritual danger Michael was facing. During a private conversation, Sister Margaret shared her own journey through this particular temptation. Early in her religious life, she had struggled with envy watching other sisters who seemed to experience profound spiritual consolations, while she often felt dry and distracted in prayer. She had wondered if God was displeased with her, if she lacked sufficient faith, or if she was somehow spiritually inferior to her sisters, who appeared to have more mystical experiences. The breakthrough came when Sister Margaret realized that God's love isn't demonstrated primarily through extraordinary spiritual experiences or dramatic external changes. Instead, his deepest love is often expressed through his patient accompaniment during ordinary struggles, his gentle strengthening during seasons of dryness, and his faithful presence during times when we feel most alone. She learned that the spiritual lives that appear most impressive from the outside often involve hidden sufferings that we never see, while the seemingly ordinary spiritual journeys frequently contain profound graces that aren't visible to observers. This insight transformed Sister Margaret's entire approach to her relationship with God. Instead of measuring her spiritual progress against other people's experiences, she began to focus on the unique ways God was working in her own heart. She started to recognize his love in small daily graces, the strength to remain patient with difficult patients, the peace that sustained her during family crises, the gradual deepening of her trust in divine providence, even when circumstances remained challenging. Our Lady of Fatima's approach offers the perfect antidote to spiritual comparison. She didn't choose the 3 shepherd children because they were the most obviously holy, the most theologically educated, or the most naturally gifted communicators in their community. She chose them precisely because of their simplicity, their humility, and their willingness to say yes to God's call without comparing themselves to others or questioning whether they were qualified for such a significant mission. The spiritual danger of comparison extends beyond comparing ourselves to other people's spiritual experiences. We can also fall into the trap of comparing our current spiritual state to our past experiences with God, or to our idealized vision of where we think we should be in our faith journey. We might think, I used to feel so close to God during college, but now my prayer life feels routine and dry. Other people my age seem to have figured out their calling, but I still feel confused about God's will for my life. I've been Catholic for 10 years now. I should be holier than I am. Here we arrive at the most subtle and dangerous spiritual trap that Our Lady of Fatima warns us against. Spiritual pride that masquerades as humility. This is the deception that sounds most holy, feels most virtuous, and is therefore the hardest to recognize and the most difficult to overcome. It's the spiritual danger that has echoed through churches, prayer groups, and religious communities across America, often embraced by the most sincere believers who genuinely desire to serve God faithfully. The manifestation of this spiritual pride can sound remarkably humble. I'm such a terrible sinner. I don't deserve God's love. I'm too broken for God to use me. I could never be as holy as that person. My prayers probably don't matter much to God. I'm not worthy to receive such blessings. These statements appear to demonstrate appropriate humility and recognition of our human limitations. However, Our Lady of Fatima would gently point out that when taken to extremes, this false humility can actually become a form of pride that focuses entirely on ourselves rather than on God's infinite mercy and power. The story of Thomas Martinez, a software developer from Austin, Texas, illustrates this spiritual danger perfectly. After experiencing a powerful conversion during his late 20s, Thomas threw himself into Catholic life with admirable enthusiasm. He began attending daily Mass, praying the Rosary multiple times each day, volunteering for numerous parish ministries, and studying theology in his spare time. However, As he learned more about the saints and their heroic virtues, Thomas began to develop a persistent sense of spiritual inadequacy that gradually undermined his relationship with God. St. Francis gave up everything for God, but I still worry about my retirement savings, Thomas would think. St. Therese trusted completely in divine providence, but I still get anxious about work deadlines. The saints found joy in suffering, but I complain when I have a headache. These comparisons led Thomas to conclude that he was fundamentally unsuited for authentic holiness, that his prayers were probably ineffective due to his imperfections, and that God could surely find better instruments for his work than someone as spiritually mediocre as himself. This false humility created a vicious cycle in Thomas's spiritual life. The more convinced he became of his unworthiness, the more he withdrew from opportunities to serve others or to trust in God's grace working through him. When fellow parishioners suggested he might have gifts for teaching or spiritual direction, he declined, believing that someone so flawed couldn't possibly be helpful to others' spiritual growth. When he felt inspired to pray for specific people or situations, he dismissed these promptings as presumptuous, thinking that his prayers carried little weight with God due to his personal failures. The breaking point came during a parish mission led by Father Robert Kim, a Jesuit priest from San Francisco who had spent years working with people struggling with scrupulosity and false humility. During Thomas's confession, Father Kim recognized the spiritual danger immediately. "Thomas," he said gently, "your excessive focus on your own unworthiness has become a form of pride. You're so concerned with your spiritual inadequacy that you've forgotten to focus on God's adequacy." This profound insight helped Thomas understand what Our Lady of Fatima had tried to teach the shepherd children. True humility isn't about focusing on our limitations and failures. True humility is about focusing on God's unlimited mercy, power, and love. When we become obsessed with our own spiritual inadequacy, we're still making ourselves the center of our spiritual life, just in a negative rather than positive way. Our Lady of Fatima chose 3 young, uneducated shepherd children precisely to demonstrate that God's work in the world doesn't depend on human qualifications, spiritual maturity, or personal holiness. Lucia was only 10 years old, Francisco was 9, and Jacinta was 7 when Our Lady first appeared to them. They had no theological training, no special spiritual practices, no history of mystical experiences. What they had was something far more important: openness to God's grace, and willingness to say yes to his call despite their obvious limitations. The children never spent time agonizing over whether they were worthy to receive such extraordinary graces or qualified to deliver Our Lady's messages to the world. They simply accepted what was given to them and tried their best to fulfill what was asked of them. Their focus remained on God's goodness rather than on their own inadequacies, on heaven's mercy rather than on their human weaknesses. This spiritual danger of false humility has become particularly acute in contemporary Catholic culture, where social media provides constant exposure to inspiring stories of saints, testimonies of dramatic conversions, and examples of heroic virtue that can leave ordinary believers feeling spiritually inferior. We see posts about people who pray for hours each day, who have given up successful careers to serve the poor, who experience mystical phenomena, or who seem to live in constant union with God. And we conclude that our own more mundane spiritual experiences are somehow second class. But Our Lady of Fatima would remind us that God doesn't call everyone to the same type of holiness or the same external expressions of faith. The office worker who offers each task to God throughout the day is living just as authentically a Catholic life as the contemplative nun in her monastery cell. The parent who patiently tends to sick children while maintaining interior peace is practicing heroic virtue, just as surely as the missionary serving in dangerous foreign territories. The student who chooses integrity over academic shortcuts is responding to grace just as genuinely as the person who experiences mystical visions. The antidote to this spiritual pride disguised as humility is what theologians call filial confidence, the trust of a beloved child in a loving parent. This doesn't mean we ignore our sins or pretend we're more virtuous than we actually are. It means we acknowledge our limitations while simultaneously trusting completely in God's ability to work through us despite those limitations. It means focusing more on His strength than on our weakness, more on His mercy than on our failures, more on His call than on our qualifications. Thomas Martinez learned to practice this filial confidence through a simple daily prayer that Father Kim taught him. "Jesus, I trust that you can do great things through me, not because I am worthy, but because you are powerful. Help me focus on your adequacy rather than my inadequacy. This prayer shift gradually transformed Thomas's entire spiritual life. Instead of declining opportunities to serve because he felt unqualified, he began accepting them while trusting that God would provide whatever grace was needed. Instead of dismissing his spiritual inspirations as presumptuous, he began acting on them while remaining humble about the results. The most remarkable change was that Thomas's effectiveness in ministry actually increased dramatically once he stopped focusing on his own spiritual inadequacy. When he taught religious education classes, his honesty about his own struggles and his trust in God's grace created a safe space for students to share their own questions and doubts. When he volunteered at the parish food pantry, his humble confidence allowed him to connect authentically with people in difficult circumstances without feeling he needed to have all the answers. Our Lady of Fatima's entire message to the world was delivered through children who had every reason to feel inadequate for such a monumental task. Yet because they trusted in heaven's power rather than focusing on their own limitations, they became instruments of transformation for millions of souls across centuries. Their example teaches us that God's greatest work in the world is often accomplished through people who are small enough in their own eyes to make room for his greatness. You've just discovered something that few people understand. These 5 spiritual dangers that can unknowingly obstruct the flow of divine grace in our lives, even when we're sincerely trying to grow in holiness. Perhaps you've recognized yourself in one or more of these patterns. Perhaps all 5 have resonated with experiences you've had in your own faith journey. But now you know, and that knowledge gives you an opportunity that many people miss: the chance to love beyond spiritual performance, to trust beyond human understanding, to serve beyond personal qualification. Because what our souls most need isn't more impressive religious experiences, more dramatic prayer answers, or more obvious signs of God's favor. What we need are hearts opened in authentic humility, minds fixed on God's goodness rather than our inadequacy, and wills surrendered to divine love rather than focused on spiritual achievement. We need the simple trust of children who know they are beloved regardless of their performance. Our Lady of Fatima summarized this beautifully when she told the shepherd children that what pleases God most is not the perfection of our prayers, but the sincerity of our love. Not the impressiveness of our spiritual experiences, but the authenticity of our surrender. Not the magnitude of our religious achievements, but the genuineness of our trust in his mercy. Today you can choose to embrace this authentic spiritual path. Pray for someone forgotten by others. Trust God with a situation you can't control. Serve in a capacity where you feel unqualified but called. Offer even your smallest acts of love to heaven's purposes, because your simple yes to God, when offered with genuine trust, can become the very instrument through which divine mercy flows into a world desperate for hope. The spiritual dangers we've explored together, making our problems the center of prayer, using faith as social media performance, treating prayer like a vending machine, falling into spiritual comparison, and embracing false humility, represent more than just theological concepts to avoid. They are invitations to examine our hearts with the gentle honesty that Our Lady of Fatima modeled for the shepherd children over a century ago. Each of these spiritual traps offers us an opportunity to choose a different path, one that leads to authentic union with God, rather than spiritual mediocrity disguised as devotion. Consider how these 5 spiritual dangers interconnect in our contemporary American Catholic experience. When we make our problems the center of our prayer life, we often fall into the vending machine mentality, expecting God to fix our circumstances in exchange for our religious practices. When our spiritual achievements become social media content, we inevitably begin comparing our faith journey to others, leading us either into spiritual pride or false humility. These patterns don't exist in isolation. They form a web of spiritual obstacles that can keep us trapped in self-centered religion rather than God-centered relationship. But Our Lady of Fatima offers us a radically different vision of authentic Catholic spirituality. When she appeared to Lucia, Francisco, and Jacinta, she didn't promise them earthly success, social recognition, or even comfortable spiritual experiences. Instead, she called them to something far more challenging and infinitely more rewarding: complete trust in God's love, regardless of circumstances, hidden acts of sacrifice that no human audience would ever applaud, and persistent prayer for the salvation of souls they would never meet. This vision of holiness translates perfectly into our 21st century American context. The office worker who offers small workplace frustrations as prayers for world peace is living the message of Fatima just as authentically as any mystic or miracle worker. The parent who patiently teaches children their bedtime prayers while struggling with their own doubts about God's presence is practicing the same sacrificial love that Our Lady requested from the shepherd children. The college student who chooses integrity over academic shortcuts, even when no one is watching, is responding to the same call to holiness that echoed through the Portuguese countryside in 1917. What makes this path so revolutionary in our current culture is its emphasis on hiddenness rather than visibility, on interior transformation rather than external achievement, on trust rather than control. In a social media world that rewards performance and visibility, Our Lady of Fatima calls us to find our deepest joy in communion with God that no camera can capture and no algorithm can measure. In a success-oriented culture that equates worth with achievement, she invites us to discover our identity as beloved children of God, regardless of our accomplishments or failures. The 3 shepherd children who received Our Lady's messages lived this hidden holiness so completely that their influence continues to ripple through history more than a century later. Lucia eventually became a Carmelite nun, spending decades in quiet prayer and contemplation. Her later years marked not by dramatic mystical experiences, but by steady faithfulness to daily religious life. Francisco, who died at age 11 during the influenza pandemic, spent his final months absorbed in silent adoration before the Blessed Sacrament, offering comfort to Jesus rather than seeking comfort for himself. Jacinta, who also died young, became known for her intense prayer for the conversion of sinners and her willingness to offer even childhood sufferings for the salvation of souls. None of these children became famous for their eloquent preaching, their theological insights, or their ability to work dramatic miracles. Their sanctity was rooted in something much more accessible to ordinary believers: their willingness to say yes to whatever God asked of them, their trust in divine love even during suffering, and their commitment to pray for others even when those prayers required personal sacrifice. This is the path Our Lady of Fatima offers to every American Catholic today. Not a spirituality reserved for specially gifted souls, but a way of life available to anyone willing to trust in God's mercy more than in their own strength, to love others more than themselves, and to seek God's will more than their own comfort. It's a holiness that can be lived in suburban neighborhoods and urban apartments, in corporate boardrooms and public school classrooms, in hospitals and shopping centers, in all the ordinary places where ordinary people encounter the extraordinary love of an extraordinary God. The transformation from recognizing these spiritual dangers to actually living differently begins with small, concrete choices that might seem insignificant, but carry profound spiritual weight. Instead of beginning each morning by checking your phone for news updates or social media notifications, try starting with a simple prayer offering your day to God and asking Our Lady of Fatima to guide your choices. This small shift in routine gradually reorients your entire day around divine rather than human priorities. When you face difficulties at work, in relationships, or with health concerns, resist the temptation to make these problems the central focus of your prayer life. Instead, try asking God how He wants to use these challenges to deepen your trust in His love, or to increase your compassion for others facing similar struggles. This doesn't mean ignoring your real concerns or pretending that problems don't matter. It means placing them within the larger context of God's loving providence and your call to holiness. If you share your faith journey on social media, examine your motivations honestly. Are you posting primarily to encourage others and give glory to God? Or are you unconsciously seeking validation and admiration for your spiritual practices? Consider spending equal or greater amounts of time in private prayer and hidden acts of charity that no social media audience will ever see. Let your public witness flow naturally from a deep interior relationship, rather than becoming a substitute for authentic spiritual growth. When you notice yourself comparing your spiritual progress to other people's experiences, gently redirect your attention to God's unique love for you and His particular call on your life. Remember that social media and even church environments typically showcase people's spiritual highlights rather than their everyday struggles with doubt, dryness, or moral failures. Focus on cooperating with the grace God is offering you today, rather than trying to replicate someone else's spiritual journey. Most importantly, when you catch yourself falling into false humility, that spiritual pride disguised as unworthiness, Remember that God's power works most perfectly through acknowledged weakness, not through self-sufficient strength. Accept opportunities to serve others even when you feel unqualified, trusting that divine grace will provide whatever is truly needed for the situation. These practical applications of Our Lady of Fatima's message might seem simple, but they represent a radical alternative to the spiritual materialism and performance-based religion that characterize so much of contemporary American Christianity. They offer a path to authentic holiness that is both challenging enough to require genuine conversion and accessible enough for anyone willing to take the first small steps. As we conclude this exploration of Our Lady of Fatima's gentle warnings about modern spiritual dangers, I want to extend a deeply personal invitation to you, wherever you are in your faith journey right now. Whether you've been Catholic your entire life, or you're just beginning to explore Christianity, whether you feel spiritually mature or completely confused about God's existence, whether you've recognized yourself in all 5 spiritual dangers, or just 1 or 2, this moment represents a fresh opportunity to encounter the transforming love of God in a completely new way. Our Lady of Fatima's message isn't ultimately about avoiding spiritual mistakes or perfecting religious practices. Her deepest desire is to lead every soul to authentic intimacy with her Son Jesus Christ, not the Jesus of theological theories or religious obligations, but the living Jesus who knows your name, understands your struggles, celebrates your victories, and loves you with a passion that surpasses human comprehension. This Jesus doesn't love you because of your spiritual achievements or despite your spiritual failures. He loves you because you exist, because your life represents a unique thought of God that has never been expressed before and will never be repeated again. He loves you with the same intensity whether you pray eloquently or stumble through basic prayers, whether you feel close to God or spiritually dry, whether you serve others heroically or struggle just to get through each day with basic kindness. The 5 spiritual dangers we've discussed are simply obstacles that can prevent us from receiving and responding to this unconditional divine love. When we recognize these patterns in our lives, we're not discovering reasons for spiritual discouragement. We're uncovering opportunities for deeper freedom, more authentic relationship with God, and greater effectiveness in loving others. Right now, wherever you are as you engage with this message, you can choose to begin living differently. You can choose to pray, not as a spiritual transaction, but as conversation with someone who loves you infinitely. You can choose to serve others, not to prove your worth, but to express gratitude for the worth God has already given you. You can choose to face difficulties not as evidence of divine abandonment, but as opportunities to deepen your trust in providential love. Our Lady of Fatima stands ready to guide you in this transformation, just as she guided 3 simple shepherd children over a century ago. She won't promise you easy answers, quick fixes, or impressive spiritual experiences, but she will promise you something far better: authentic peace that doesn't depend on circumstances, genuine joy that can coexist with suffering, and real love that grows stronger through both success and failure. The choice is entirely yours, made not once, but renewed each moment throughout each day. Will you continue patterns of spiritual mediocrity disguised as devotion, or will you accept the invitation to authentic holiness that might look quite ordinary from the outside, but represents extraordinary cooperation with divine grace? If this message about Our Lady of Fatima's warnings against modern spiritual dangers has touched your heart in any way, I warmly invite you to become part of our growing community of Catholics seeking authentic spiritual transformation in contemporary America. Please subscribe to our channel and click the notification bell so you'll be the first to know when we explore more profound truths from our rich Catholic tradition that speak directly to the challenges of 21st century life. But more than just subscribing, I want to hear from you personally. In the comments below, please share which of these 5 spiritual dangers resonated most strongly with your own faith journey. Have you struggled with making your problems the center of prayer? Found yourself caught up in spiritual social media performance? Fallen into the vending machine approach to religious practices? Battled with spiritual comparison or false humility? Your honest reflections not only help our entire community grow in understanding, but they also create connections between believers who might be facing similar challenges. Even more powerfully, I invite you to share your own stories of faith, hope, and transformation. Have you experienced moments when God surprised you with grace in unexpected ways? Times when surrendering control led to greater peace than you imagined possible? Instances when serving others despite feeling unqualified resulted in profound spiritual growth? Your testimonies become sources of encouragement for others who might be walking similar paths and wondering if authentic spiritual transformation is really possible in our complicated modern world. Please also tell us what you learned or felt while watching this video. Did one of the stories about Maria Rodriguez, Jennifer Walsh, Sarah Thompson, Michael O'Brien, or Thomas Martinez connect with your own experiences? Did Our Lady of Fatima's approach to holiness challenge or comfort you in particular ways? Sometimes the insights that seem most obvious to you are exactly what another viewer needs to hear to take their next step toward authentic relationship with God. Your engagement transforms this from a one-way presentation into a genuine community conversation where we can learn from each other's spiritual journeys and support one another's continued growth in faith, hope, and love. Every comment, every shared story, every honest question contributes to creating a space where authentic Catholic spirituality can flourish in our contemporary American context. Thank you for taking this spiritual journey with me today, and may Our Lady of Fatima continue to guide you toward the profound peace and joy that come from authentic intimacy with her Son, Jesus Christ. Until we meet again in our next exploration of Catholic truth, may God bless you abundantly and draw you ever closer to His Sacred Heart. Look how blessed I am. God is good. Grateful, Os Church Life. The notification pings constantly as likes and comments pour in on another carefully curated post, showing our spiritual highs, our church attendance, our volunteer work, our Bible study insights. It seems innocent, even inspiring to share our faith journey with others. But Our Lady of Fatima offers us a gentle warning about something that has become increasingly common in our digital age. When authentic spirituality becomes public performance, something sacred can be lost in translation. This danger didn't exist when Our Lady appeared in Fatima in 1917, but her timeless wisdom applies perfectly to our social media-saturated culture. The issue isn't sharing our faith or encouraging others through our testimonies. The spiritual trap lies in the subtle shift that can occur when our interior spiritual life becomes dependent on external validation, when our relationship with God begins to revolve around how others perceive our holiness, rather than on genuine communion with the divine. Consider the story of Jennifer Walsh, a marketing executive from Phoenix, Arizona, who experienced this spiritual danger firsthand. After a powerful conversion experience during a weekend retreat, Jennifer felt genuinely called to share her newfound faith with others. She began posting daily scripture verses, photos from Mass, inspirational quotes about trusting God, and detailed accounts of her prayer experiences. Her posts received hundreds of likes and dozens of comments from friends praising her spiritual transformation. Initially, this positive response felt like confirmation that she was fulfilling God's call to evangelize through social media. But gradually, something troubling began to happen. Jennifer found herself evaluating her spiritual experiences, not primarily based on how they deepened her relationship with God, but on how they would translate into engaging content. She began choosing prayers, devotions, and spiritual practices based partly on their shareability. During difficult spiritual seasons when she felt dry in prayer or struggled with doubt, she felt pressure to maintain her online image of constant spiritual victory. The breaking point came during a particularly challenging period when Jennifer's father was diagnosed with early-stage Alzheimer's disease. While she was genuinely struggling with fear, anger, and questions about God's goodness, she felt unable to share these authentic struggles with her online community. Instead, she posted vague requests for prayer wrapped in positive language that didn't reflect her true emotional state. She realized that her social media presence had become a curated version of her spiritual life that was increasingly disconnected from her actual interior experience. Our Lady of Fatima would understand Jennifer's struggle perfectly. When she appeared to the 3 shepherd children, she didn't call them to perform miracles in front of crowds or to seek attention for their spiritual experiences. Instead, she taught them the profound value of hidden prayer, secret sacrifices, and interior communion with God that no human audience could see or applaud. She showed them that the most powerful spiritual acts often happen in complete silence, witnessed only by heaven. The spiritual danger of faith as performance extends beyond social media into our church communities as well. How often do we find ourselves praying more eloquently when others are listening? How frequently do we choose our words in Bible study, not primarily based on truth, but on how they will make us appear spiritually mature? When we volunteer for ministry positions, Are we motivated primarily by love for God and neighbor, or by the recognition and respect these roles bring? This doesn't mean we should never share our faith publicly, or that all religious social media content is spiritually dangerous. The key distinction lies in our primary motivation and the effect these activities have on our interior life. Are we sharing our faith because we genuinely believe it will help others encounter God's love, or because we enjoy the positive feedback it generates? Does our public spiritual expression flow naturally from a deep interior relationship with God? Or are we unconsciously crafting our private spiritual life to provide material for our public persona? Our Lady of Fatima's approach offers a powerful alternative to this performance-based spirituality. She appeared to 3 children, who were completely unknown, who had no social media following, no platform, no audience beyond their immediate family and neighbors. Yet through their hidden prayers, secret sacrifices, and quiet faithfulness, they became instruments of transformation for millions of souls worldwide. Their influence didn't come from their ability to articulate their experiences eloquently or to present their struggles in inspirational language. It came from their willingness to say yes to God's call, regardless of who was watching or applauding. The most profound spiritual transformations often happen in the hidden corners of our hearts, in the silent moments when no camera is recording, no audience is watching, and no social media algorithm is measuring our engagement. These are the moments when God meets us most intimately, when authentic conversion takes place, when real sanctity is forged. Third spiritual danger: treating prayer like a spiritual vending machine. God, I've been praying the rosary every day for 2 weeks now. When are you going to answer my prayers about finding a husband? The frustration in Sarah Thompson's voice was unmistakable as she confided in her spiritual director, Father David Chen, at Sacred Heart Parish in Seattle, Washington. Sarah, a biomedical engineer in her early 30s, had been faithfully attending daily Mass, participating in adoration, and maintaining consistent prayer practices since her recent return to the Catholic faith. Yet she felt increasingly disappointed that her spiritual efforts weren't producing the specific results she had been hoping for. This conversation revealed one of the most common spiritual dangers that Our Lady of Fatima wants modern believers to recognize: the subtle transformation of prayer from authentic relationship with God into a spiritual transaction system. This mindset treats religious practices like deposits in a cosmic bank account, expecting that sufficient spiritual payments will automatically produce our desired outcomes. The danger here is particularly seductive because it can masquerade as devotion and faithfulness. After all, isn't it good to pray consistently? Isn't regular Mass attendance commendable? Absolutely. But when these practices become primarily motivated by what we hope to receive rather than by love for God Himself, they lose their transformative power and can actually become obstacles to authentic spiritual growth. Our Lady of Fatima demonstrated a completely different approach when she appeared to the children in Portugal. She didn't promise them earthly rewards in exchange for their prayers and sacrifices. Instead, she called them to offer their sufferings for the conversion of sinners, and in reparation for sins against the Immaculate Heart of Mary. The focus wasn't on what they would gain, but on what they could give. This orientation toward sacrificial love rather than personal benefit transformed these simple children into powerful intercessors whose influence continues to ripple through history. Consider how this spiritual danger manifests in contemporary American Catholic culture. We might find ourselves thinking, I've donated this amount to charity, so God should help my business prosper. I've been faithful in my marriage, so why are we still struggling with infertility? I've been serving in parish ministries for years, so why did I get passed over for this promotion? These thoughts reveal the underlying assumption that our good works create a kind of spiritual debt that God is obligated to repay according to our expectations. The problem with this transactional approach to faith is that it fundamentally misunderstands both the nature of God and the purpose of spiritual practices. Prayer, Mass attendance, charitable works, and devotional practices aren't primarily methods for obtaining desired outcomes. They're means of deepening our relationship with God, conforming our hearts to His will, and participating in His work of redemption in the world. When we approach spirituality with a vending machine mentality, we inadvertently place ourselves in the position of the customer and God in the position of the service provider. This dynamic distorts our understanding of who God is and what He desires for us. The almighty creator of the universe is not a cosmic wish-granter whose primary function is to fulfill our personal agendas. He is our loving Father who knows what we need better than we do, and who is always working for our ultimate good, even when his methods and timing don't align with our preferences. Father David Chen helped Sarah understand this distinction by sharing the story of Saint Monica, who prayed for 32 years for her son Augustine's conversion without seeing any apparent results. During those decades, Monica could have concluded that God wasn't listening, or that her prayers were ineffective. Instead, she persevered in faith, trusting that God's timeline and methods were perfect, even when she couldn't understand them. When Augustine finally did convert, he became one of the greatest saints and theologians in church history. Monica's prayers weren't unanswered during those 32 years. They were being answered in ways she couldn't see, preparing both her son's heart and the circumstances that would lead to his dramatic transformation.